Here we are, back at it again, with our last 4 entries in the Tier 1 of our Alien Incident Encounter and Abduction Iceberg. And don't worry if you haven't seen my other videos in Tier 1, they're in no specific order, so you can go back and watch those at any time. So let's go ahead and start this off. Nordic Aliens. Said to closely resemble people of Scandinavian descent, Nordics are possibly one of the most human-like alien beings that we know of. They are just a bit larger than humans, said to typically be fairly muscular and can be anywhere from 5 to 7 feet tall. They tend to have light blonde or reddish hair and somewhat of a large forehead. Normally they have green or blue eyes, but some claim that they only wear contacts to hide the fact that they don't actually have an iris. Because of their similarity to us, they can easily blend in with normal people and can freely explore our planet. It's said that they come from somewhere in the Pleiades star cluster, or even from Venus. Nordic aliens are thought to have been represented throughout history in many different ancient cultures and religions. It's believed that in these cultures, the Nordics were often depicted as angels and even gods. In Greek mythology, many gods were described as having fair skin and blonde hair. The Hopi Native Americans also have a prophecy which involved the true white brothers, coming to signal the end of Fourth Age. In more recent years, the Nordics are often thought of as one of the more peaceful alien races. Many contactees have received messages from these beings, with the aliens preferring to telepathically communicate rather than getting directly involved with us. They typically deliver messages of peace, love, and harmony, and are known to be deeply connected with our spiritual development. They have told people of their distant relation to us and claim that we are much like them, just at a lower developmental stage. Nordics don't often abduct people either, but when they do, it almost always involves messages of peace as well as concern towards the well-being of Earth. One of the first modern abductions involving the Nordics is thought to be the case of George Adamski. George claimed to have been in contact with the Nordic aliens throughout the 40s, 50s, and even said that he flew with them to the moon and other planets. He claimed that they were very peaceful beings and referred to them as space brothers. In later years, he would go on to show pictures he had taken of this flying saucer and also write several books about his encounters. One man, Howard Menger would come out in the 50s with his own story in which he claimed to have been in contact with the Nordic aliens throughout his whole life. He would describe his encounters in several books over the coming years in which he would tell tales of his trips to the moon and meeting in orbit around Saturn. These beings were friendly and peaceful, and he had claimed to have had many conversations with the Space Brothers. In 1954, it's rumored that President Eisenhower met with Nordic aliens while on vacation in California. It's officially stated that the president left the vacation house during the evening for an emergency dentist trip after he chipped a tooth on a chicken wing. However, after this, many people came forward to claim that he actually visited the nearby Edwards Air Force Base, making first contact with these extraterrestrials. Apparently, he met 2 Nordics who tried to convince him to destroy America's nukes in exchange for help with our spiritual development. This offer, however, was declined, and instead it's stated that Eisenhower later came to make a deal with the Grey alien race. It's said the Greys would be allowed to abduct people for experiments, and we would in turn have access to some of their advanced technology. Said to be one of the most well-known encounters with Nordic aliens in North America, many say that they were the beings that abducted Travis Walton out in the Arizona mountains in 1975. Travis was a logger, and after a long day, he and his co-workers were on their way home when they saw a flying saucer. Travis jumped out of the truck where he was suddenly struck by a beam of light, and then the saucer and Travis disappeared. He showed up at a gas station 5 days later with claims that he'd been abducted by extraterrestrials. He would go on to describe several beings, one of which matched the Nordics' description, as well as recounted a message that we needed to stop killing each other and live in harmony with the Earth. Although many encounters with these beings happened a long time ago, the term Nordic wasn't actually commonly used until the 1980s. In ancient times, they were often referred to as Space Brothers or even the Tall Whites. They never seemed to have any hostile intent towards humans, instead trying to help or even teach us. Often concealing their identity, it's possible that they're already among us, with some even stating that they are and are part of a supervising government body studying our development. It's said that they don't often communicate face-to-face and normally use dreams and telepathy to talk to normal humans. Nordics prefer to keep their distance from people, observing us from far away on their spacecrafts. The Allagash Abductions. In 1967, 4 college art students would go on to plan a trip out in the wilderness of the Allagash River. The 4 men were in their early 20s and they were ready for this adventure. This group consisted of Chuck Reck, Charlie Foltz, and twins, Jim and Jack Weiner. The plan was to canoe and fish all while exploring the area. On a Friday night, the group would leave Boston heading for the Allagash River in northern Maine, hiring a pontoon boat to drop them off in the Telios Lake connected to the Allagash waterway. They would canoe and camp on the waterway for the next few days with nothing out of the ordinary happening. By the next Thursday, they had reached Eagle Lake, where they decided to make camp and try to catch some fish in the deeper water. It had grown quite dark, so the group made a large bonfire to help mark their camp before setting out on the water. Sitting there on the calm water fishing from the canoe, Chuck suddenly became overcome with the sensation of being watched. He would later say, "I turned toward the direction from where I felt this and saw a large bright sphere of colored light hovering motionless and soundless about 200-300 feet above the southeastern rim of the cove." Chuck yelled at the others to take a look as the glowing sphere rose above the trees. As they adjusted to the light emanating from the sphere, they began to see a strange plasma-like motion to it all. He would claim that there seemed to be energy pathways flowing from pole to pole as it rotated in a gyroscopic motion. The sphere was divided into 4 colors, which were oddly fluid and enveloping, all while oscillating in brightness. Charlie grabbed a nearby flashlight, pointing it towards the flying sphere, flicking the light on and off, blinking it at the craft. The craft instantly came to a dead stop before changing the direction and heading straight towards them. It slowly crept along the water as it got close, and a tube-like beam shot out of the bottom of the sphere, creating a ring-like shape that rode on top of the water. As the light got closer, the men started to panic, and they all paddled as fast as they could back to shore. However, the light soon caught up to them and engulfed them in this sort of glowing tube. They made it to shore with Jack saying, "It was just behind us, and I could see that we were never going to outrun the beam. It was advancing too fast, and I remember thinking, holy shit, this is it, we'll never get away." The next thing I knew, we were on the shore getting out of the canoe, looking directly at the object, which was now 20 or 30 feet above the water. Chuck was frozen in his canoe, being the only one that didn't immediately rush to shore. He sat there transfixed on the light emanating from this strange craft. Jack said, "The beam was coming out of the bottom of it like the object was sitting on the beam. It hovered there, right in front of us, completely silent for what seemed like 4 or 5 minutes. Suddenly the beam was pointing towards the sky. The object began to move up and away from us towards the southwestern sky and then shot into the stars and was gone in just a second." His twin brother Jim would comment, "There was no mistake that it was coming directly to us. Then I remember standing on the lakeshore watching the object hovering above the lake 50 to 75 yards in front of us. Then the search beam went upward into the sky and we saw it moving away at a tremendous speed. We all seemed to be in a state of shock. We just stood there, unable to move or talk. When the shock wore off a little, Chuck finally got out of his canoe, walking back up the shore in a dreamlike state. The group walked back to camp silently, still unsure of what happened and what exactly they had seen. Making it back, they realized something had changed with the large bonfire, with Jim stating, "When we left to go fishing, we set large logs on the fire to burn for a good 2 or 3 hours. The entire experience seemed to last at most 15 or 20 minutes, yet the fire was completely burned down to red coals. None of the men had any idea how the fire had burned down so quickly and had no memories of being gone the hours it would have normally taken. The next day they continued on their trip to the Allagash waterway with nothing else of note happening for the rest of the journey. They eventually made it back home where they would tell this story to family and friends, but soon moved on with it and just went on with their everyday lives. It wasn't until years later that any more details of this encounter with a UFO would surface in any of the men's memories. Jim would suffer a head injury, causing him to have temporolimbic epilepsy, which in some cases can cause strange and sometimes false memories to form. The doctor treating Jim was aware of this fact and would go on to ask him about anything strange he could now remember but couldn't recall before the injury. Jim told his doctor everything about the night with his friends on Eagle Lake, which he now had more memories of. He would go on to talk about waking up in a dark room, completely paralyzed and surrounded by terrifying creatures. The doctor would go on to suggest Jim reach out to a UFO researcher as he didn't feel the memory was caused by any seizure. So Jim would go on to contact a mutual UFO network investigator, Ray Fowler, in the Boston area, who would then proceed to study in detail this case for the next 2 years. The MUFON investigator then got in touch with Tony Constantino, a professional hypnotist, who would later have the entire group of friends undergo hypnosis sessions with him throughout this study. Fowler would question the four men independently during each session, trying to find inconsistencies in their stories. However, he actually found the opposite, with all four men basically having the same repressed memory. According to Fowler, all four were forced to undress and sit on some plastic-like bench in front of a bright white light. The creatures then examined the men's mouth and eyes with a small pencil-sized light one by one before placing them in a harness and making them flex different muscles. They were then led over to tables to lie down on, with the creatures bringing over some strange device and attaching it to the men's private parts. The aliens then took samples from all over their bodies, collecting fluids, feces, skin scrapings, among other things, from each abductee. The four men would make chilling statements while undergoing hypnosis and recovering these lost memories, with Charlie Fultz saying, "It's like a doctor's office. I get that. It's cold like a doctor's office is cold. They put the panel over your chest, then they scrape your arms and your chest, your legs and thighs. We shouldn't be here. I just keep thinking, I want to be back in the canoe." Chuck Rack, in a separate hypnosis session, would make a comment about being able to see Charlie being examined by these creatures, saying, "I see some sort of device on him. They've got this looks like a silvery, it looks like the curves on it. It's almost like it sucks something. He's got his head tipped way back. It's almost like he's in pain, where we can't help him. All we can do is watch him." Jack would say, "They're right there. Their face is right in my face. I don't know why. I don't want to know. I don't want to know what they want. They're saying things. In my head, they're saying, don't be afraid. They say, do what we say, just do what we say." His brother Jim would say, They don't know what to do. I think they think I'm going to come after them. I feel like I want to. I feel like I want to. The first one that comes near me, I'm gonna throttle him. I don't like these things. I don't care where they come from. They shouldn't be doing this to people." After the alien beings examined the four men, they were given back their clothes and led into another room. The creatures lined up the men in front of some sort of portal on the wall and sent them through it one at a time. And just like that, they were all then back outside, floating down this tube-like beam of light, all while feeling a strange sensation throughout their bodies. The canoe hadn't moved at all while in this light beam, with the group then placed right back into the same positions they had been taken from. In this session, the twins would also recover memories about being abducted as children. The MUFON investigator Fowler would comment on this with his own theory, stating that he thought the aliens would be more interested in twins for experiments, just as humans are. Identical twins have long been considered great for medical testing due to having almost the same genetic makeup and the same environment while growing up. During this 2-year investigation, Jack and his wife Mary would also be abducted from their mountain house out in Townend, Vermont. This time, however, it would leave physical evidence on Jack, with the bottom of his feet burned and weird scoop marks above his ankle that could be seen. What made it even stranger is that years prior to this, he had gone to the doctors to have a cyst removed on that same ankle. In the end, the doctors couldn't pop it, so they had Jack go get it surgically taken out. The surgeon couldn't figure out what it was either, so he told Jack he had to send it to the CDC for further analysis. When Fowler heard of this, he started looking into Jack's medical records, finding the lump had indeed actually been sent to a pathologist in Washington, D.C. He tried to contact these people in D.C., but could never get anyone to cooperate with his inquiry. Fowler then had both Jack and Mary undergo more sessions of hypnosis in an attempt to get more details about this most recent abduction. It's said that Mary was unresponsive to the hypnosis, but Jack was able to recall some more details about this encounter. Jack would state that a house-sized craft landed in their yard, and that they were compelled to go out to it. They were then taken aboard this craft and separated from one another. Jack would recount almost the same experience as before, with the creatures there to only collect samples from both of them. After the examination, the two were reunited and then sent back out of the craft. The beam floated them up to their house and then literally through the house, where they passed through closed doors and walls. They were laid back in bed and were both so overwhelmed by a lethargic feeling that they just went back to sleep immediately. After the 2-year investigation concluded, Fowler would go on to say that he believed the whole incident and never found any deception in the men's statements. He said, "Our inquiry revealed that each of the witnesses exhibited the typical benchmark characteristics of other abductees." He also had them all make detailed sketches of their encounter, with none of them having prior knowledge of this request. The images and descriptions they would provide were so similar to each other that Fowler was convinced that the group really had been abducted. Fowler made another comment saying, "All witnesses were subjected to detailed interrogations, rigorous character reference checks, 12 recorded/transcribed hypnotic sessions, and a battery of psychological profile tests." Fowler also looked for fantasy-prone personalities, past traumas, and signs of psychosis, but never did find anything that he could relate to these repressed memories. He concluded his report by saying, "Each of these theories was critiqued and eliminated in the light of the evidence collected during our investigation." Falkville Metal Man. On a night in October 1973, Jeff Greenhaw, the Falkville police chief, was settling down to bed with his wife. He had put in a long day of work, it was 10 p.m., and he was nearly asleep when he would receive a call from an emergency line from the 911 dispatcher. They had received a call from a very frantic woman claiming that a flying saucer had landed in a field just outside of town. Greenhaw, in his own words, thought he was just dealing with an idiot, but went to go and check it out anyways. Driving up to the field, he didn't immediately see anything strange or out of the ordinary. Chief Greenhaw would then decide to drive around for a while on the nearby roads, thinking that he might as well be thorough about it before he went back home. He would cruise around the property, but he didn't see anything of note. With it being pitch black outside, he had to scan the darkness with his headlights as he drove, and wasn't even able to see much of anything. Greenhaw had checked nearly everywhere, but he went down one last gravel road on the property anyway. Then just 300 feet down that road, he would see something that would change his life forever. The chief then saw some humanoid figure in a strange outfit, so as he approached, he yelled out the window of his car, asking if they were needing assistance. Greenhaw said, "When I saw him standing in the middle of the road, I immediately stopped the car and asked if he was a foreigner, but no sound came out of his mouth." Once getting only 15 feet away, his headlights would strike this creature. The high beams would then illuminate its entire body. The police chief immediately knew something was wrong, as it appeared that this man was wearing some kind of metallic suit that he said resembled a very thick aluminum foil-like material. Greenhaw explained, saying, "After that, things were just so strange. This wasn't real. It wasn't really happening, but it was happening to me. Why me?" Directly in front of him, he saw an entity around 6 feet tall, covered in metallic material, also having something like an antenna sticking out of the top of its head. He would go on to describe this creature in further detail in a later interview, saying, "My initial thoughts were maybe aluminum foil, but there were no pieces around there after it was all over. I don't know what to believe at this point. It looked like his head and neck were kind of made together. He was real bright, something like rubbing mercury on nickel, but just as smooth as glass. Different angles giving different lighting." He also described this creature's movement as jerky and possibly mechanical, stating, "Whenever I think about it, when I was a child I used to watch the movie, Lost in Space. The robot in that movie, it kinda reminded me to that to some extent." He once again tried to talk to the human-like figure, with Greenhaw later stating, "I said something to the effect of, 'Howdy, stranger,' and there was no response at all. I didn't push my luck. At that point, I reached in and turned the blue lights on the patrol car, and seen how reflective the material really was." The police chief then grabbed his Polaroid camera he just happened to have with him at the time and snapped 4 pictures of this creature that would later be known as the Metal Man. He laid the pictures down on the console, trying to be fast. Greenhaw said, "Then when I looked back, it was moving away from me, so I decided to chase it down, and if I have to, run it over. That didn't happen either." This creature was said to have run away at speeds much faster than a human was capable of. The chief chased after the humanoid, driving through a field at about 35 miles an hour, still unable to keep up with it. He said, "It wasn't moving like you or I would move. He ran in a bizarre way, seemed to have springs in the feet for propulsion, could cover about 3 meters in every way. He was running faster than any human I ever saw." The chief would eventually crash the patrol car into a ditch as the creature continued to run away into the night, never to be seen again. Although he didn't manage to catch the creature, he did, however, manage to take those 4 Polaroid pictures before it vanished. Unfortunately, the first picture is just black, as he seems to have forgot to use the flash, but the next 3 images would show the creature that he had seen. They showed a humanoid figure in a wrinkled metallic suit standing still in front of the camera while reflecting its flash. These pictures showed exactly what he had described in his encounters, and he and his pictures would go on to become world famous over the coming years. Greenhaw never tried to make money off his stories or pictures and was only ridiculed and isolated within his small town. He said, "I was hired in January of 1973, and this all came down October 17th, 1973. And then just a few weeks later, he would go on to resign from his position." He claims that after people heard about his encounter, his life became much more difficult, saying, "I pretty much withdrew myself from the public for years. People were supposed to be my friends. The only thing I found out is that I really couldn't trust anyone. I withdrew. I ran and I went places to try to get away from it." Although he didn't talk to many others about his experience, he did treasure the original photos, keeping them in a safe place for many years. However, Greenhaw's house would later be robbed, with the photos being one of the few items actually stolen. He said, "I took them out and looked at them frequently for the 10 years I had them. I thought, that's really weird. The only 3 things I had with me that night, the shotgun in the car, the service revolver, and the pictures. All 3 of them came up missing." Greenhaw and his wife would go on to adopt 3 children, as well as having 2 of their own, with him associating this with his alien encounter in the past. He said, "I turned out to be the person I never dreamed I would be because of what happened. It made me hard, but it made me strong as well. I didn't believe that there was any other life source in the universe, but that really changed." Nowadays, many different theories are out there trying to explain this alien event, all of which have some decent reasoning. To start off with, many pointed out that less than a month earlier there had been huge news of the Pascagoula alien abduction, where 2 friends out fishing were kidnapped by bizarre creatures. This also happened to be not too far away from Falkville, Alabama, taking place just 1 state over in Mississippi. Others have claimed that this whole incident was just caused by teenage pranksters that happened to live in that area. They could have called in a false report about a UFO, then dressed in some weird sci-fi costume running around pretending to be the middleman. With all this happening out in the rural country with nothing but Greenhaw's headlights, many think that he really did believe what he saw, so his brain just filled in the blanks trying to make sense of the situation. Another theory is that Greenhaw and his friend came up with this whole hoax, using an old asbestos fire suit covered in aluminum foil. They would take advantage of all the other abduction stories in the news at the time and would use the pictures to create this whole hoax. Some UFOologists have even theorized that the middleman was some kind of robotic probe from an alien craft. They state that advanced alien technology is what gave the middleman its features and abilities. Walt Andrus, a director in the Mutual UFO Network, did do an in-depth analysis of Greenhaw's images and made the copies that we now see online. Following the analysis, Andreas would conclude that the whole incident was most likely fabricated, and probably inspired by the Pascagoula abductions that happened just weeks earlier. And although Greenhaw never did mention anything about seeing a flying saucer, you can clearly see something that looks like one in one of his picture negatives. It's also said that this image is also fabricated, as many say it just looks like a modified lantern top or maybe an old surgery light. While we may never know whether Greenhaw's story was true or not, we do know that he never actually made any financial gain off of his alleged encounter. If anything, this whole event has just made life harder for him, with him stating that he regrets ever having coming into contact with that creature. Nowadays, though, it does seem that he's living a happy and fairly quiet life. He rarely speaks to the public, keeping his life mostly private. Domston Blobs. Stig Rydberg and Hans Gustafsson, 2 co-workers, left their work at their dry cleaning job to have a night out on the town with their girlfriends. They would go on to have a nice night. They went for a drive, ate some food, and just enjoyed each other's company. Around 2:30 a.m., they all decided to call it a night, and they took the 2 girls back to their home. While on their own way home, not even half an hour later, the 2 young men would have a very frightening experience. While on the way back to Hans' house, they made a pit stop in a field next to a village of Domsden. Apparently Hans had to take a dump. After doing his business, the 2 would come to notice a strange glow coming from the nearby woods. Stig and Hans decided that they were too curious to not investigate, so they walked about 150 feet into the trees trying to find the source of this light. At first, they thought it was just a large bonfire or something similar, but as they got closer to look, they quickly realized that this was not the case. The light somehow didn't light up the environment and wasn't warm to them whatsoever. The two then stopped at a no camping sign, trying to get a better view. They were then shocked at what they would see. Hans would later say, "We saw a strange disc. It was resting on legs about 2 feet long. It seemed to be made of a peculiar shimmering light that changed color. This disc was around 15 feet wide and only 3 or 4 feet tall, sitting there immobile on its tripod legs." Stig and Hans would then later come to see 3 or 4 strange creatures wiggling around on the ground near this glowing disc. Before they knew it, they were surrounded by these odd 3-foot-tall blob creatures, with Stig later saying they were like protozoa, just a bit darker than most, sort of a bluish color, hopping and jumping around the saucer like globs of animated jelly. They didn't seem to have any extremities and were described as very quick-moving loafs. The creatures soon lunged towards the two, which made them understandably terrified. They say this is when it exploded into a fight to the death, as the blobs began to engulf their arms and legs with their gelatinous bodies. They said that the creature's body was much tougher than it looked, and Stig would later say that it was as if he was trapped in a magnetic dough. The two men tried to grab onto the strange blobs to pull them off, but were unable to. They say that it was impossible to get a good grip, as they felt like they were fighting a soft gelatinous dough. This is when the two would start to be dragged towards the glowing disc. They would both go on to smell something horrible as this was happening, with Hans describing this, saying, "The drag the things exerted was terrific, and they gave off such a terrible smell, like ether and burnt sausage." While being dragged, they would see several other creatures engaging in what they would say was some sort of macabre dance. As soon as they would pull off one blob, another would just latch on. They tried to scream, but claimed no sound would come out of their mouths. Stig, trying to punch the creatures, would only have it engulf him all the way up to the elbow, seemingly having no effect at all. While fighting, a moldy fish smell would spread in the air, just adding to the already stinky conditions. These blobs had both surprising strength and speed, with them able to drag him while also dodging the majority of the punches that they were throwing. Hans described this, saying, "It almost seemed as if the creatures could read my mind. They parried every move before I made it. Their strength was not so great as the technique with which they wielded it." Stig was eventually able to free himself. Not looking back, he made a mad dash towards the car. The creatures were chasing after him and had almost caught up. He jumped in the car, and then noticed Hans was still back there, holding onto the no camping sign for dear life. The creatures had Hans pulled almost completely horizontal and wouldn't give up on their attempt to drag him away. With the blobs almost on Stig, he punched his fist into the horn, blaring it in hopes that a passerby might hear it and come to intervene. However, this had an unexpected effect on the alien creatures. They seemed to just ooze out a gray substance and then quickly retreated back to their craft. Hans fell flat to the ground before getting up and running to the car himself, where he joined back up with Stig as fast as he possibly could. Before making their escape, they saw the disc rise out of the woods, with Stig later stating, "The light became more intense in its takeoff, and a smell that reminded us of ether and sausages burns permeated the air. But the most remarkable of all things was the sound. It was a thin, loud, and intense sound that we felt rather than heard. When the ship took off, we were shaken by vibrations, very fast ones that almost paralyzed us. The ship then disappeared from our views. I thought it went straight up in the sky, but Hans claimed it disappeared in an arc on the waters." Both knew that they would never be the same again. Even though this encounter only lasted about 5 minutes, they knew it would change their lives. For 20 minutes, the two men sat in their car as they tried to hold back tears and calm themselves. Once the trembling passed, the two men finished their drive back home, agreeing then and there that they would keep this whole event a secret. They were afraid that their story might cause them to be ridiculed or even have their mental sanity questioned in general. Following this whole ordeal, the two would suffer from extreme anxiety and insomnia, while also being covered in bruises and having red, almost burned eyes. Feeling that they need to tell someone about this and what had happened to the two, they would go on to confess to the Gustav family 3 days later while Stig was over for breakfast. Hans' mother, Anna, would say, "I burst out laughing at Stig as he told it. Yes, we all did. Everything sounded so weird." Even so, she would end up contacting Sweden's largest newspaper, Helsingborg Dagblad, which immediately picked up the story, making the two known throughout Sweden within days. After the newspaper article was published, the Helsingborg police would call the two in for questioning. This changed more into an interrogation, as the two were kept there for more than 11 hours, while one police officer and two detectives asked them questions about their encounter. Even a member of the Swedish military was present, apparently concerned about unauthorized infiltration of their sovereign airspace. The police even hid a microphone in the room, hoping that when they left the pair alone, they would hear them discussing something not meant for them to hear. However, this never happened, with the two mostly just sitting there in silence, wondering if the officers believed them. One of the two detectives, Sven Rudolph, would later confess, "Actually, we did not leave out anything without asking pertaining to their encounter, but we couldn't find anything that is considered a hoax." After days of psychiatric and medical tests, both Stig and Hans were pronounced to be both physically and mentally healthy young men. The doctor was convinced the two had indeed suffered from a traumatic experience. However, the doctor also stated that this trauma was from an unknown origin. The Swedish military would then go on to denounce all of this as a hoax, even though there really was no proof of this either way. And some people believe that since we haven't heard of these creatures trying to abduct people since then, the military may have been correct about this incident after all. However, others think that the jelly blobs may normally be more successful in their kidnapping attempts, abducting people and never bringing them back. Well, that was it for Tier 1. I'll be moving on to Tier 2 here in the next week or two. Thanks again for being here, everybody, and be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done that already. Be sure to leave a comment, too, about any of these that you think should be its own longer video, or about any other topics that I should cover in the future. If any of you thought the Eisenhower meeting the Nordics was interesting, I actually have a longer video about that you can check out whenever. Thanks again. This was Matt, and I want to believe.